Hi, everybody. My name's Julia Torres, and I'm here to talk to you today about libraries and literacy for liberation, new strategies and visions. So you should know about me that I am one quarter of the Disrupt Text team. So Disrupt Text is both a movement and it is a really special, how can I say, pedagogical stance that some folks have taken to try to decolonize what we think of as the literary canon. There are many literary canons throughout the world, as I'm sure you know, and we've been stuck with one for a pretty long time. So myself, Lorena Herman, Dr. Kim Parker, and Trisha Abarvia came together to create Disrupt Text so that we could get people to think in new ways about what's worthy of academic study. I'm also a teacher librarian in Denver Public Schools in sunny Colorado and a 16-year language arts teacher veteran. I am the secondary representative at large within the National Council of Teachers of English. And so that means that I basically am like the grand mama of all secondary language arts teachers, and I'm supposed to be representing our voices at the largest professional organization for teachers in the United States. I'm also a Book Love Foundation board member, which is a foundation dedicated to helping teachers raise money and gain knowledge about the power of classroom libraries and choice reading within classrooms. So my job is to support the grant winners, and then I also help allocate funds. And this year we got $86,000 for 68 different classroom teachers to get full classroom libraries to support our young readers. I'm also the Educator Collaborative Book Ambassador. The Educator Collaborative is an amazing collaborative of educators dedicated to freedom and progressive thinking and to just doing things in ways that have not been done. So we gather together regularly twice a year to hold global functions, which are gatherings where they're free professional development for people around the world to learn from each other. And we do this also on a more regular basis, but the Ed Collab is an organization I'm really proud to be a part of. And my book ambassador role is to just help people learn to love books. You can reach me on Twitter at JuliaAaron80. I'm not much of a Facebooker, but I try to make myself available on Twitter whenever possible. So feel free to reach out to me there if you have more questions after this presentation. So the first thing that I want to talk a little bit about is time. I want to talk to you a little bit about the fact that in most schools around the world, we have this notion of time, and students come to us for a certain part of the day, and that time is really measured. And we believe that we have only a certain amount of time to get them to do the things that we have told them are important for them to do, and to learn the knowledge that we think as adults is important for them to have. Another thing that's important for us to consider is the fact that when you are thinking about the early days of education, we all tap into this collective conscious knowledge of what it means to be educated. We all tap into this idea of what it means to have knowledge of books, to have knowledge of literacy, to have a thirst for knowledge. And so some of our earliest stories are folklore. Some of our earliest stories are oral traditions that are passed along from generation to generation. So as you think about knowledge and just this big abstract idea of literacy, I want you to think about it as more than just books on a page or words on a page. I want you to think about it as a collective body of knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation. And sometimes that means that it'll get wiped out and new people will bring in new ideas to the conversation, as is happening right now as we revamp the literary canon and make room for more people to talk and think about what's important. When I think about collective consciousness, I think about the dream space. And I think about the Aboriginal concept of dream time and how it sort of exists at the same time that we exist here in this created notion of time and space. And when we're in our school buildings, we have created a very somewhat artificial place where we try to protect students from the outside world so that they can have a safe space to talk, think, dream, create, explore, and be curious and invent a world, hopefully, that will be better than the one that we're living in right now. But unfortunately, what often happens is, just as with these Aboriginal children who were put in schools, we are experiencing the effects of colonization. The world was colonized. There are very few places that didn't experience the after effects of colonization. So when you look at these Aboriginal children, I want you to think about the fact that they were in school using pencil and paper and sort of being conditioned to learn in a way that was very foreign from the way that might have been natural to them or intrinsic to them within their culture. So as we talk and think about libraries and literacy for liberation, we've always got to come back to that idea of decolonization. In the United States, decolonization is something that we've really only started to talk about within the last few decades. Decolonizing the mind means that you are undergoing a consistent and constant process of undoing the programming that happens in schooling, where you are told that you are not enough, that excellence is exterior to you, that you need to change something about you to meet the needs of the system so that you could be a good worker, what have you. You'll see in this picture of Native American students that they were put in schools where their names were changed, where they were told that they needed to have different religions and be indoctrinated into a school of education that was very different from how they learned and processed knowledge. So colonization has been a very harmful practice through which people have changed not only the way that we learn and think about the process of learning, but also the way that we interact with one another and the way that we see literacy. So in the next slide, you'll see that words have power. And it's important for you to understand that when I talk about libraries and literacy for liberation, I don't just mean literacy in English. I mean literacies. And I also mean multimodal literacy. So we've got to think about literacy from going from that two-dimensional words on a page in physical books ideology into a 5D version of what does it mean to be literate today? Does it mean that I'm listening to a bunch of podcasts? Does it mean that I make space in my curriculum for rap lyrics? Does it mean that I look at the canonical text of the past and evaluate whether it's really worth it for us to keep pushing the same stories on our young people using the excuse that the lessons they teach are universal, when a lot of the time they are not universal. They are capturing a time period, a type of language, and a belief system that existed for a time, but is very different and disconnected from the time that we live in now. When we think about the books that are often taught in schools, we've got The Giver by Lois Lowry. We've got Divergent, which is a YA novel that a lot of students choose to read. And then we got Fahrenheit 451. So Fahrenheit 451 is taught a lot of places, and it's ironic because it deals with information, it deals with words, it deals with power and control. So it's really important that we reflect on the ways that libraries and literacy are used to either liberate people or to have more power and control over them. When we tell students, you cannot read these books, they are not challenging or rigorous enough, they are not worthy of academic study. You need to learn what I learned when I was young. You need to learn what belonged to previous generations. That is a way of passing on dogma and not actually respecting what they like to read, their choices. The next slide has a picture of some books that have been recently published that are very popular here in the United States. All of these books were written by people who succeeded despite, or perhaps to spite, the inequities in a system that was not built for them to succeed. So we need our students to see themselves as creators, not just consumers. And if you are constantly told that the only books that have value are written by people who have died or who don't look like you, who are writing about a time and a place that doesn't really connect with the life that you're living now, then how are you going to see yourself as a creator? It's really important that we think about the ways that owning literacy can be a force for liberation for our students. The next slide talks about the disappearance of school librarians. Here in the United States, there has been a drastic drop in the number of certified school librarians in schools because many people think that librarians only pass books back and forth to students. Some of the things that I'm responsible for doing are making sure that students learn to love reading. And in the next slide, you'll see this is a typical picture of students in schools these days. There's a lot of falling asleep, there's a lot of lack of engagement, and there's a lot of forcing by adults of children to read books because we stick to tradition, because we think that that's what's good for them. And we tell them that they've got to do it. A lot of it is because we really do believe that they need to be literate in a cultural capital in order to function in society, that they need to know about mythology. That might be true, but is secondary education the time and space to do that? The next slide is a documentary from Vice called Last Chance High, and it documents an extreme case of extremely disenfranchised students in Chicago public schools. It was really important for me to show this documentary to my students so that they could see that they weren't the only ones who felt like school was not a place for them. They weren't the only ones who felt miserable in the school system that they were assigned to attend and be a part of. They do not have a choice. These days, as more and more of us are going to digital education, because we have to due to COVID-19, it's really important that we think about the fact that we can no longer compel students to do what we say, going back to that first slide, every hour and minute of the day. On the next slide, you'll see a survey that I gave to my students asking them if they would call themselves readers. You'll see that over 70% out of over 200 responses did not identify as readers. Yet you'll also see a picture of me here with one of my students who saw the movie The Hate U Give. I gave him a copy of the book, and look at his face. Look how excited he looks. He kept at it. The book went overdue. I let him keep it and keep reading it. And the exciting thing is that he began to see himself as a reader, even though he never liked to read before. Such is the power of letting our students choose books that connect with their lived reality, that connect with the language they speak, and the lives that they are experiencing. The next slide is me with some of my students, and then a blog post that I wrote on my blog called Genrification Motivation. And that is about a process of genrification that I did in my library to try to make sure that I got my library more in sync with what you might see in a bookstore. So when my students come in now, rather than having to know an author's name, rather than having to search for an author alphabetically by their last name, which is a skill that is not normal for most high school students who did not grow up loving to read. They can come in and they can see sections now that have horror and LGBTQ and science fiction, dystopia, mystery, romance. They can come through and they can find things in the section that connects with their loves, their passions. You can see that as I changed to genrification, my circulation went up. It went down a bit in November because we had some holidays and some times when people were gone, but it also went back up. And my circulation has increased substantially, which has been really exciting to see, especially given the fact that we did not have a library at all at our school for over 8 years before it reopened. So the next slide shows you a stack of books. And I want everyone to think a little bit about their stack of books that they have at home or in their classroom. How often do you do something called a library audit? How often do you look through the titles to see what they have in common? What are the areas that are missing? And what are the things about your books that might draw students to them? Do you have mostly the classics because those are open source and easy to access? Or have you written grant money and asked community members to try to fund a classroom library that reflects the types of books that your students want to read? The next slide shows you some national school library standards. These talk about encouraging students to inquire, include, collaborate, curate, explore, engage, think, create, share, and grow with the books they read and in the school communities they belong to. If it helps, you can Google the American Association of School Librarians, and you can see these standards and then reflect about whether standards exist in your school community. How can you encourage students to be a part of the process so that they do not feel like school is happening to them, but rather with them? So the next slide shows some apps that I use. Libby is one through which my students can access digital ebooks and audiobooks. Goodreads is a place where we build community. You'll see a picture of my students participating in a book club around The Hate You Give. And then you'll see something that is called Book Face Friday that happens on social media, where people take pictures of themselves with the covers of books that meant something to them. We have got to make sure that our students are engaged with books that connect to who they are, but we've also got to meet them where they are. And a lot of our students are on social media. So finding a way to connect our students to the books they love and the authors that they want to hear about through social media is key. When we think about the importance of libraries, you've got to, of course, remember on the next slide, we see that we've got history, words, there is trust involved, there is memory retention, and then the reading experience. All of that is so important when learning to love reading and when learning to see yourself as a storyteller. So I love to do read-alouds in class. I do read-alouds often. And that enthusiasm that I feel when I'm reading aloud from a book that I love is contagious. But I also encourage students to use apps like Flipgrid to be able to tell their own stories. Our students need to know that their personal history is important, that their words matter. They need to know that we trust them to be able to tell their story in the best way possible. And they also need to know that memory is fluid, so they can remember an event very differently. We can read aloud to a class full of students, and each one can have that experience differently, and that's okay. We know that everyone has a story. In the next slide, you'll see that I have peeled back a layer in order to expose those words. Everyone has a story. And if our students are encouraged to think about the way that their story matters and that how it is part of the human story, it is part of the greater human story, and that they are just one small part of a global community rather than seeing themselves as people who own every story, I think that that is a really important liberatory practice. In the next slide, you'll see folks sitting around telling stories around a campfire. I love this slide because I think it's so important to remember that oral storytelling traditions matter too. Everything does not have to be written down. It is very important for us to remember that there are still cultures in the world that value storytelling, that value things like podcasting, that value human connection just as much, if not more, than having students sit down, read a book, and then write an essay about it or take a test. We have got to be bigger in our thinking rather than just going through the same motions which are disenfranchising our students. So I'll take you back to this idea of the collective consciousness and how each of our individual stories come together to form this bigger collective understanding of what it means to be a part of humanity. In the dream space where creativity exists, where people are free to be creators, that's what we want for our students. So the very, very last slide is a library of infinite possibility. There is a story called The Library of Babylon by Jorge Luis Borges. And the most interesting thing about the Library of Babylon is that there were so many stories in it. There were countless stories. And you can think of each one as belonging to the story of a lived reality. And if all of us are free to actually write and read stories that we love, then that is actually the practice of liberation. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope this was useful for you. If you have any questions, please let me know. I think that one of the things that I wanted to impress, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat that I'm trying to answer about how we can apply these things to our school communities that are going virtual. And one of the things that I think is really important is to go step by step, right? So a lot of us feel that pressure that we have to just fix everything right now, or we feel like we can just take what we did in the physical environments and turn it right into the digital environments. And the two don't correlate. You can't do everything that you did live in a virtual environment. It's not going to be the same. So we have to find new and creative ways to change what we have done. And we've also got to involve our students more. We've got to solicit their feedback and input. The reason that I kept going back to the Aboriginal idea of dream space is because it's my understanding that in the dream space, that's where our reality that we live in is created. So we are going to need to be more creative in the imaginative space of what is possible, rather than relying on what has always been done. Because I think what has always been done in the educational system has been very restrictive. And there are reasons, right? There are many scholars who've written about the reasons why we have done school the way that we have done it. There were certain times when the school system worked the way it did to produce factory workers because it was the age of industrialization. So you wanted everyone to have a basic level of knowledge so that they could then be factory workers. There was a time when there was a move to corporatization. So all these large corporations needed people who were able to do office work. So school changed a little bit to meet that need. But we have not kept up with the demands of what it means to actually be a paid worker in this world. How many of your students will tell you they want to be professional gamers or YouTubers? That seems unrealistic to us, but what do we know? We don't really know what the future holds. So that's why I think that we need to move away from doing what we've always done and from thinking the way that we were educated is going to work for our students. And we need to think bigger and broader and include them more in what we're doing. I'm going to try to capture some questions from the chat because they're coming pretty fast.
Yes. Annie just mentioned something really interesting. She said, sometimes when we suggest a particular title, which is very good to support the understanding of students to the culture, school system, doesn't agree with it, right? They said it has feminism or sexuality. How do we convince them? Mostly Westerners who don't read our language and don't know exactly about the books.
Yeah, so censorship is often a tool of white supremacy, and it is a tool of oppression. A lot of times what happens in these colonized worlds and countries that we live in, you all know that at some point, people came and colonized your native land, which is most of the reason why you speak the language that you do. Well, part of that process is to make native people learn the language and the ways of learning that the colonizers knew, so that their ability to function in the society would be determined by how well they're able to function in that language. Connected is the idea that language is a way to transmit ideas. So the ideas of the colonizers were in those works that were in their languages. So then the ideas get infused into the population and get passed on from generation to generation as well. So it's very important to, if you're a librarian, understand, and I'm still learning this too, that we practice selection, not censorship. So it is one thing to select appropriate books for your school population. It is another to censor. And it is also so important to include student voice. So when people are coming in and they're saying, we don't want students to learn this, or they shouldn't be learning this, what do the students think? It's their education. We are supposed to be there to facilitate learning. That's the job of the teacher. And it's not a bad thing, I don't think, for the teacher to become the student. Paulo Freire talks about that. If you've read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, then you already know. If you haven't, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a great place to start, where you can learn about how the education system has been used to hold people back. And part of that is telling them, you can't read this because it's bad for you. So when folks are out here and they're saying, oh, you're pushing a feminist agenda, the question that one of my colleagues, Trisha Abarvia, I'm connected to her through Disrupt Text, one of the questions that she always asks folks is, what are you protecting? What are you protecting when you are refusing to allow certain books into the reading lives of your students? I see a question about how to engage secondary children from home learning during the pandemic. I think read alouds are really powerful. I think it's even more powerful when students can do read alouds to one another. Poetry is amazing. And though professional poets don't really like the Instagram poets, that's a place to start. And the Instagram poets like Rupi Kaur and others have drawn students in to literacy in a way that sometimes other poets can't do or don't do. So I think it's important to see, gateway stories, authors, genres. If someone only wants to read manga or only wants to do stuff with graphic novels, start there. I was just telling a bunch of librarians about the fact that a lot of Westerners had never heard of that manga called Your Name. That's the English name. I don't know how to say it in the language that is the actual language for that manga, but it's titled Your Name. That's the English translation. And apparently, from what I've been told, it is the most popular anime movie that has ever been made. And I said, it's really interesting that nobody over here knows about that. So that's the East-West divide. And I think that now just seeing all of your faces, this is evidence that we live in a global society and we need to think bigger than our small isolated environments. And we have to move away from thinking that our communities and the beliefs within our communities are the way everybody should operate and think and believe and behave. And we've got to encourage our students not to think that way too.
Macy just said that the name is in Japanese and it's called Kimi no Nawa. So now we know about it.
Kimi no Nawa. Thank you so much. Awesome. Okay.
That's
Kimi
great.
no Nawa. I will remember that.
For those who were not in the chats before, next to the participants down below, you have a small arrow that you can click and then you can raise your hand. Once you raise it, I will unmute you and you can share with us what works for you in your library, what works for you in your class, some questions that you might have, and then we can keep this discussion going.
I'm looking in the chat to try to see if there are any other questions that folks have, but I'm going to follow your lead, Juan Carlos, on how.
Priska would like to say something.
Oh, hi. Oh, thank you for the opportunity. It's good night from Indonesia. Okay, so from me, actually, thank you for sharing this with us. I did it in this pandemic time. We do a lot of storytelling through online, through Google Meet. And then because it's just like, only 2 months. So for 2 months, I don't think it's boring. But in the next school year, where we are not really sure how long it will be, I'm kind of like almost run of idea like how to make this storytelling more interesting. I mean, I try with like the hand puppet. Even I have my own recording with the voice illustration. I made my YouTube recording, something like that. I share with students. They have good feedback. It's just I'm just worried. I mean, like in next months where we are not really sure how long this pandemic will be. Like if you can share with us how your trick and tips to make your session more interactive through this online learning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very
much.
Of course.
Yes, of course. So I can only speak to what I'm working with, right? Because I don't teach every content area. But my first step has been to look at my library website and to try to see how much of my offerings were teacher-centered and were requiring folks to be in my library space. Because, so much of my teacher identity is tied to a specific place, which is the library. I don't have it. So what am I going to do? Well, first of all, I want to have read alouds at specific times. We know that students and young people do need some sort of routine. They do thrive well with some sort of routine. So going back to what I was talking about in terms of time, I think we're going to have to restructure our understanding of time. I do not think it's realistic for me to schedule classes all day, every day to come to the library. But I do think that if I say every Monday at 2 o'clock, I'm going to release this read aloud, every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, we're going to be able to discuss the read aloud, then they can have that reliability of knowing that I am going to be a person they can count on to provide something at a certain time. Some schools here have tried to follow the bell schedule. So they make it so that a student has to sit in front of a screen for the same amount of time that they would have been in their chairs at school. I do not think that's realistic. A big part of what school is supposed to be about is encouraging curiosity. So part of my job as a curator of resources is to go out in the world and find things that will make my students curious. So Google has these awesome virtual tours that you can do of places like Versailles, virtual art museums. The Whitney Museum here in the United States also has been doing these cool lecture series. So curating collections of virtual experiences that students can have on their own time, and then perhaps the teacher, if they want to bring the virtual class to the virtual library to share. But I think we need to shift away from teacher-centered learning experiences as much as possible. I see this as an opportunity for students to be diving into what they are curious about and love to learn, and then bringing it back to share with their classroom community and with us as educators. So if your content is math per se, there has been a major push, from my understanding, to make mathematics more applicable to our students' lived realities, to what they're experiencing day by day. So then how can we line up the standards and what we need for accountability purposes to show that they're learning? How can we say, okay, student, I need you to learn these things. I need you to show that you've learned them. Here's a menu of options for how you can show that you've learned them. Here are various places you can go to find out information that will be specifically catered to you. So you set it up so that it is more inquiry-based, so that it is more student-driven. But then it's really important to have student role models. We cannot always be the people that the students are looking to saying, I want to perform academics so that I can impress my teacher. It needs to be about students being role models of academic excellence for one another, because then they will feel inspired by each other. And then I think it's a more natural type of learning environment that you can create and produce or reproduce. So we need to ease off of the time that we expect them to be present in front of a screen and ramp up the amount of curiosity that we encourage.
Great. We've got P. Weiger here, would like to say something too.
Okay.
Yeah. I am loving your ideas, especially about ramping up curiosity. My question goes back to the beginning, though. I'm wondering, do you recommend genrifying in an elementary school library? Our school just got renovated, so this summer I will be moving my entire library collection from one building to the other. And so you've really kind of spurred me to think about what might that look like.
I think that it's a good idea to think long-term, right? So what skills will students need to love a library their whole lives? So that once they're out of the school system, they still naturally will go to a library and see it as a place where they can find information, read for pleasure, because too many of our students think that reading is a skill only and first, and something that they need to master to prove to us that they are worthy of a certain grade or level, reading level. We've all but done away with reading levels here in a lot of places because the American Library Association has a lot of information, and School Library Journal have a lot of information out there about how leveling is not good. At least not for students, right? It's a teacher tool. We need to be aware that we are supposed to have that information to inform our instruction, but a lot of students feel marginalized and oppressed by these levels that are put on them. So if you were to genrify an elementary library, I would think about, or even survey the students, what are the types of books that you like to read the most about? And then don't make it too exhaustive. For little ones, I would say maybe 5 or 6 genres is good. Then as they get a little bit older, then you can go into maybe middle school. We've got 10 to 11 genres that we're working with. Then you expand, and it's important to have their cooperation in doing this. And if you can, and if you have the budget, have more than one book copy of books to go in multiple genres. So for example, if I have an LGBTQ book that happens to be romance, do I want to ghettoize that book by putting it in the LGBTQ only section? Or do I want to have one copy in LGBTQ, one copy in romance? So that if you're browsing in romance, you might get LGBTQ as a book. You understand that LGBTQ books are in sci-fi, in dystopia, in romance, in mystery. So you don't just think that those books belong in one space. But then also, if you want to go to the LGBTQ section because you only want to read books that are about LGBTQ plus identities, then I have a section for that too. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
That's awesome. Great ideas. Milagros, would you like to say something too?
Hi, hey, good morning, good afternoon. Good evening,
Milagros, I
everybody.
love your name. I love it.
Thank you very much. First of all, I love you. I love all of your ideas. I think all of what you have said is very important. Actually, especially about original languages, native languages and stuff, because in my country, because we started school in March, I'm from Peru, we couldn't start, or most of school didn't start because of the pandemic. So the Ministry of Education came up with like a homeschooling system on radio, television, and online, which is actually very great, very, very great. They pulled it off in like 10 days. And there was this like this scandalous situation because they were teaching about how people spoke differently when they didn't have Spanish as a native language, but instead Quechua, Aymara, and many of the others. And there were a lot of people that were like even offended. I don't want to say offended, but I can't think of anything else, because they were teaching kids the improper ways of speaking a language. And I have lived in a land where many of native Quechua speakers live. And that is a very common way to speak. And they were kind of like shaming them because they were saying like, no, you can't teach children to speak like this. That is a wrong way. And I want to do that question you said, like, ask them what they are mad about, like what they are protecting, because it really didn't make any sense. Like, okay, they just speak a little different because they have a different language. Have you ever tried to learn a second language? Sometimes you get the accent, sometimes you don't, and that's fine.
I have two responses to what Milagros just shared. One is an article called Decolonizing the Mind. It's an essay by a West African author. I will type his name. It won't have the right accent marks because I don't have those on my computer right now, but I'll type the name of the essay in the chat. Decolonizing the Mind. All of us, as part of the legacy of colonization, have to deal with the fact that language has been used as a form of oppression. So we have internalized that, and the way that that looks is that we sometimes bully one another and try to oppress folks who don't speak the language that the majority speaks. So in your country, if Spanish is the language of the majority, then indigenous languages are going to be the language of minoritized people. So it's important to educate people about how their thinking is the result of colonization and that what they're doing is wrong. Decolonizing the mind is a way to do that.
We will share all these resources that you just mentioned, Julia, with them in the Facebook group, if you're okay with that, so that more people can have access to that.
Yes. I'm going to go ahead and type the name. I typed some links in there. I'm trying to keep up with the chat, but it's going very fast. Were there any other folks who wanted to speak?
Natalie would like to say something.
Okay.
You're on.
Hi, Julia. So my question is this. We all have, we all have diverse books in our classroom. We're looking to try to create libraries that are more inclusive, right? What suggestions would you have for taking it further than just populating the shelves with these books and the kids pull some and we read some aloud? And I'm on the elementary level. What would be some suggestions for taking it further? Because I feel like I used it and my library was a whole lot more inclusive, but in terms of sustaining it and where the kids are really engaging and getting those messages on a more relevant and deep level.
So some of the work has to be done before you bring the quote unquote diverse text in, right? I don't know whether your student population is predominantly students of color or predominantly white students, but the work looks different in those environments. So I'll just talk briefly about the three different possibilities. If you are a white educator in a population with predominantly students of color, then you've got to own your own privilege, first of all, and positionality, and then speak with the students about your limitations and what you do not know and the information that you do not have. and then model being that continuous learner who is interrogating their own positionality and power and privilege, you've got to do that work. If you are an educator of color in a student population group that is predominantly students of color, a lot of our work is rediscovering the wealth that already exists within the canon of people of color. So you've got to restore that idea. You are a writer. Your stories are worth telling. Your language or languages are all valid. The way that you communicate is awesome. You don't need to change anything about you. There's nothing wrong with you. That's the continual messaging that I give. There also needs to be some discussion of the powers at play. So on my board, I had words like marginalization, erasure, oppression. Very small children are capable of learning these words and then just changing the definitions for them as they get older to make the definition more complex. But use that language so that students can continually, for everything we read in my AP English Lang class, they always had to come back to politics, oppression, erasure, marginalization, power. How does that show up in this work? If you don't think it does, how is that a reflection of you? Or what, maybe it doesn't show up in this work. Why not? Those are questions that we would always ask. So everything doesn't have to be about the world of oppression. There are many books that deal with people of color just living joyfully and being happy. And those are very valuable as well, because we don't only want to have books that are inclusive that deal with pain. The publishing industry is overly obsessed with publishing stories about Black pain, from my personal experience. So I think it's a good idea to make sure that there's balance. Is this story about folks who are living and enjoying their lives? There are some wonderful books too that talk about how folks have dealt with colonization. That is so important, because colonization both is the power that is enacting from externally upon us, but then it's also something that happens in our minds. And with the older kids, I really like to talk about that idea of a double consciousness. So how are you showing up when you are one among many? And then how are you showing up when you just blend in? When I take my children to Brazil, they're brown, so my kids just feel like everybody's brown, this is cool, I feel good. But when I take them places where they are minoritized, or where they are not, everyone doesn't look like them, then they show up differently. So discussing that with them, how that feels in your body, and the stresses that that might make you experience, and then how you might hold on to trauma. Potentially, some people, somewhat controversially, say that trauma is held within your DNA. So if your country has history of genocide against Native people, whether they be indigenous Native people or a certain tribe that has been minoritized, as I know in Europe that has happened. There have been groups of folks that have been minoritized, linguistic minorities, but then also ethnic and cultural minorities. And sometimes they've been killed or massacred. There are folks who say that that trauma is stored within the DNA. So talking about that early, as finding a way to talk about that is so important.
And
Julia, it's great.
I have a question about if you're a person of color in a predominantly white space, which I have also experienced, that can be somewhat traumatic, because the children themselves will often exhibit prejudicial or discriminatory behavior towards you, though you are in a position of authority and you're supposed to be one who is helping them understand how power and privilege work. So I would say, to be quite honest, I left that environment because it was unhealthy for me. But you need to have support among faculty and in administration who will support you doing the work and talking about these things. And if you can't find it, then you need to evaluate whether that's a healthy school environment for you to stay in.
And I quickly wanted to share something that I shifted in my classroom library this year that was powerful, was I got rid of this notion of multicultural books, because I remember in the past I would have a basket that was multicultural books, but more centering, like I had categories like journeys and family and relationships. And in those categories, that's where it was, that's where the whole notion of inclusion. So it's like, there are families that are brown, there are families that from India, there are families that's white, and their relationships and changes and journeys that look different with all different groups. So to me, that was a powerful shift for the students to go to that section of the library, pull a book, and they can see representation of many different types. So that was a big shift for me, and it worked really well, I felt.
I love that. Yes, absolutely. I'm seeing in the chat here, somebody saying, what about a white person in a predominantly white school or a 50-50 school? First of all, because our school systems, I personally believe, are geared toward more of a type of education that encourages students to be compliant. So we have a very compliance-based model. You behave, you do what I tell you, you learn what I tell you has importance, and you'll get this grade. That's how we manipulate them, because grades are academic currency. So with very young children, we encourage them still to be curious. I think we need to ask the questions, but not provide so many answers if you're in a predominantly white school environment. Ask the important and uncomfortable questions, and then pause, don't give the answers, and let them talk and think through it. Do I have worksheets or slides as an example for how to do this? There are many places that do. I'm gonna give you a few links. If you go to the New York NYU School of Education, I believe, has a framework for culturally sustaining pedagogy. And I just want you to look in, you'll have to Google it, but it's like the NYU School of Education, and Dr. David Kirkland spearheaded that effort, and it's a framework for culturally responsive pedagogy. And then I would say also that if you're looking to support young, very young students, you need to look for some synonyms or go for the easiest language you can use, but just don't avoid it. But you still got to talk about how it feels to be an outsider rather than marginalized. As they get older, you can use the language marginalized. But you start with simple language, but then bring in those ideas. I'm not really sure. Okay, there's a book called Antiracist Baby as well that just came out by Ibram Kendi, Dr. Ibram Kendi. I'm putting that in the chat. There's another book, Decolonizing the Mind. That was the essay that I wanted folks to read. I usually just read portions of it. I hope that I spelled his name right. My apologies if I did not. Decolonizing the Mind, the first part talks about how a child was made to feel like he was inferior, and he had to wear a sign that said donkey, and he had to wear that in school in front of other children. He was humiliated for speaking his native language. So we've got to understand that these systems that colonization put in place, school is the way it is for a reason. This is an optimal time to disrupt that. And then when you really think also about Things Fall Apart, that book about how colonization just destroys everything that is beautiful about a person's native way of being, then I think it is really important work for all of us to restore some sense of identity. If you are a white person, it is my experience that a lot of white people in the United States, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about people who believe themselves to be white. Whiteness is both an appearance, a racial classification, and we know that race is a social construct. It doesn't really exist. If you were to find my bones 10,000 years from now and some white woman's bones 10,000 years from now, they might not be able to tell who had the brown skin, who was melanated. So we have to understand that race is a social construct. Teach our students that. But we've also got to understand how that has played into all these systems of power and positionality in all of our places. And I got off the topic of literacy, but there were a lot of people who were asking about how to do this work with young students. Picture books. There are many picture books that you can start with that will help you talk about these things really, really early on. And use simple language and then make it more complicated as you go on. Thank you so much, Susie. I appreciate your comments. That's really nice to hear.
Great. Yeah, Chad is here. I think he would like to share some ideas or ask some questions. Are you around, Chad?
Yeah. My first thing is, Julia, I'm a longtime follower on Twitter, so I just love your work and was so excited for you to join us today. But second, there are research out there for online sources such as like Raz Kids having racist depictions of different cultures within the text, within the how they're depicted in the story. Are there any other online sources that we should, maybe take a cautionary look at since we're in this time of online learning?
So with regard to language and oppression, there are many resources through CUNY, which is out of New York City. They have some resources for how to support students who are multi and bilingual. I think those are the students that are going to be minoritized the most by what we are experiencing through online learning. Because when people panic, the default mode is to make yourself comfortable. So folks are making themselves comfortable by doing what they're familiar with. And they're also speaking English because that's what they know how to do. I'm speaking English right now. It would be more complicated for me to do this in Spanish, but I could. And then Portuguese would be, my preference. I could probably be just fine. So, I think where we are is at a crossroads where it's going to be empowering for us to put tools in the students' hands and ask for them to explore them and then come back and tell us what worked and didn't work, and then also to ask them how they prefer to learn things. So as far as online resources, go to CUNY through their School of Education, go to NYU School of Education for Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy, get the book Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, that is like one of the first books you should read, Django Paris and Sami Alim. And then there is another one that's amazing called We Want to Do More Than Survive, that is about abolitionist teaching by Bettina Love. Strongly suggest that folks read that one as well. And then go back to Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And my copy is like really circled and underlined and just marked up, because I'll pull things from that and say to folks, let's check in. Is what we are doing, is this model oppressive? There is nothing wrong with stepping back and saying what we are doing is not actually helping kids. So let's recalibrate. And always, always include them. Include students who have graduated from your school. Include students who are the older ones who have gone through all the years at your school. Ask them what worked and what did not work. Have them come back and work with the young students. Okay, some folks are asking for me to share titles again. I'm not sure what titles they want.
We can try to. I will rewatch the session afterwards, and I will type it and put it in the Teashares Facebook group. Would that work?
Yes, and we can communicate via email as well. Definitely. So I can give you a list of things. Someone's asking me if that's the framework, Elaine, for studying culturally sustaining pedagogy or for applying culturally sustaining pedagogy in a virtual setting. There's one that Dr. Kirkland put out there for how you can do culturally sustaining work in an online environment. So yes, that looks like it. The one from 9:02 a.m. or what's 9:02 to me, that looked like it. I'm trying to see if there are any questions. I always love it when people put white fragility in anywhere, because if you can't even say the word white or black comfortably, then that's not good. So there's work that needs to be done there. And if we are encouraging our students to grow and change and get uncomfortable, then we have to do that as well. And I'm typing anyone who says that a conversation about race, class, power, privilege is not appropriate for young students needs to really think about who they are protecting, because that is exactly the time to talk about it, is when they're little, so that they don't grow up and have to unlearn things as an adult, because that's very painful. And that's after you've already figured out that you've done harm, operating in the world, doing collateral damage, showing up places, and doing microaggressions and other things. Let's save people from having to learn that as an adult by supporting learning it when they're young. And again, I cannot impress enough on folks that creating that environment where students are encouraged to be curious is so important. Be curious. I don't have all the answers. I don't ever want to be that person that has all the answers, because too many of us want to be seen as the quote unquote savior, which is why I think a lot of folks like To Kill a Mockingbird so much, because that book has a white savior in it. I don't want to say that everyone likes it for that reason, but there are a lot of folks who unconsciously gravitate toward that book because of that. And that's work that they need to do. I've seen a lot of people, turnover is so bad in my school environment. Teacher turnover is so bad that I will admit, I was just talking to one of my friends who, me, her, and one other teacher, we are the only 3 who have stayed in the building since 2014. The only 3 out of the whole building, serving 2,000 students. So think about that amount of instability and what that creates for them. So I don't want anyone else to come into the school to save and then decide it's too hard and leave. We don't want that. So it's really important, if you're committed to this work, then you're committed to feeling sad sometimes, to feeling hopeless, to understanding what it means to not have the answers. You're committed to doing this in partnership with the community that you serve. So that means in partnership with the parents as well, because we do serve them, but we also have to remind them that it is not your job to be a part of the problem, not the solution. And you are a part of the problem if you never push back and you never question anything. So I'm just going to finish this remark here, and then if anyone else has anything to add.
It's been such a great session, Julia. Really inspirational, and hopefully a turning point for most of us.
I'm so happy that folks were able to join me this morning. Thank you so much for, you know, the honor of being here. Here in the United States, it's Father's Day today, and my father and my stepfather have both passed away. So, but my father was a world traveler. He traveled all over. And so this is my way of honoring him, being here with all of you today. And so I'm so happy that I got invited to do this. And I'm so glad that, that you all made time to hear me. That's a huge honor.
Julia, amazing job. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.